Historians assume in general that the way West German post-war society dealt with the Nazi era was primarily characterized by avoidance of contagious discussions and in particular a suppression of the Holocaust issue. But is it true for all media in equal measure? Previous research on the post-war period in West Germany has paid little attention to the cinematic examination of the recent past. And if so, the research focused mainly on fictional feature films, which, in direct succession to the UFA, abducted audience into another, supposedly apolitical reality with romantic comedies and so-called Heimatfilme. The erosive entertainment offered by feature films fitted in well with the general social and political mood, which refused to engage critically with the Nazi era and the Second World War, and in particular avoided a debate about the Holocaust, even largely banishing the subject from social discourse. But what did these look like in documentary films which could not simply fade out the recent past? Couldn't they have broken the illusion of an ideal world? In fact, it has not been possible to answer this question very precisely until now, because film historical research has mostly concentrated on three types of documentary films which have been known by widespread press reactions. These were, on the one hand, the so-called atrocity films, such as Death Mills, which were produced by the Allies in the immediate post-war period with the aim of confronting the German population with the crimes of the Nazis by directly showing the horrors of the concentration camps. In fact, however, these films tended to promote the population's reactance towards the Allies. The strategy was therefore quickly abandoned. And on the other hand, there were widely acclaimed international productions such as Nuit, Brouillard, Night and Fog by Alain Resnais, or Mein Kampf, and Eichmann und das Dritte Reich by Erwin Leiser. I should also mention the films made in the GDR by Karl Gass or Annerly and Andrew Thorndike, such as Du und mancher Kamerad or Unternehmen Teutonenschwert. All of these documentary films were characterized by a critical attitude towards the Nazi past, but as films coming from abroad, they were hardly successful with a broad mass of West German society. But what did the reprisal of the recent past look like in West German documentary film productions? When we start our research about West German documentary films of the early Federal Republic, we encountered a problem and a surprise. The problem was that there was relatively little research on these films due to the fact that the material was difficult to access in archives scattered all over Germany. In fact, there was not even a central finding aid, a catalogue or database to find out which films had even been made. So it was very helpful that we have created in the framework of a DFG project about the history of documentary film in Germany a large database, which is meanwhile the precondition of any research about documentary film in Germany. By this database, we were able to get an almost complete overview of the filmmaking of the era. Obviously, we still had to go to the archives to watch the films. The surprise during this research was that we noticed an impressive diversity of documentary films in different media, or more precisely said, in different media milieus. Put simply, we can distinguish three categories of documentary film. First, commercial documentaries that were intended for exploitation in cinemas. Second, documentary films produced by various social actors within the framework of political education work. Third, documentary films of the new medium, television. Are the documentary films of these different media contexts and media milieu do argue in the same way? In short, no. They differ both in terms of their media and aesthetic structure and in terms of the ideological narratives they present. To illustrate this, I would like to mention a few examples of each category. I will begin with a category of commercial documentaries that were intended for a mass audience in the cinema. These included films like Kreuzweg der Freiheit, beiderseits der Rollbahn bis 5 nach 12 or Das war unser Rommel, all of which were produced between 1951 and 1953. These films largely follow the narratives that are widespread in society, which I will shorten here to 3 theses. First, there is no collective guilt. The German people were seduced by Hitler, who is thus the main culprit. The German people are the greatest victims of the war. Second, not everything in the Nazi era was bad. In particular, there was also the honest German soldier. The Wehrmacht had nothing to do with the crimes of the Nazis. Third, dictatorial Bolshevism is trying to overrun the democratic free West. It is more important to counter this threat than to come to terms with Nazi crimes. What is striking about the way these films are made is that they mainly reuse well-known film material from the war newsreels of the Nazis and the Allies, and partly also unpublished film material of the propaganda companies at low cost, merely re-edited and underlaid with a democratized off-commentary that just about met the constitutional standards of the FRG. Films such as Kreuzweg der Freiheit by Johannes Häusler, which had openly displayed revisionist tendencies and mourned the so-called lost German Eastern territories, remained the exception. They were also perceived as a provocation by the official authorities of the FRG and were only shown under cutback conditions or were not accepted by the audience in the same way as other commercial productions, which just follow the narratives I have just described. The documentaries of these periods therefore predominantly have the character of archive or compilation films, whose visual aesthetics are still determined by those of the Nazi propaganda films, even if now the off-commentaries have undergone a democratic transformation. They are primarily designed for commercial exploitation, which wanted to reach a mass audience with cheap productions and appeal to them with the emotional show and memory value of well-known footage. The second category of documentary films concerns political education work, which was an important era of application of documentary films in post-war Germany that should hardly be underestimated. Politically, education in the Federal Republic was organized by political parties and churches, but especially by the Institute for Film and Image in Science and Education, called FWU, and the Federal and State Centers for Homeland Service, as well as the state film offices. Nevertheless, the films from these contexts were hardly known, not least because some of them are difficult to access today. To make matters worse, they are not in themselves comprehensible in the same way as cinema films, since they were conceived for a different reception practice. This is evident in 2 peculiarities. On the one hand, the films are usually comparatively short, 10 to 20 minutes in length. On the other hand, off-commentary is used sparingly in them compared to the cinema films. The events are evoked rather than commented. This can be explained by the fact that they were intended for discussions in school classes, in university seminars, or events of political education work, in which there was always a discussion about the film moderated by the organizer. Accordingly, the function is not to comment on or re-evaluate the events of the recent past on their own, but to stimulate a discussion among the audience about the recent past. In addition, in many cases, there are also supplementary materials such as accompanying booklets that provide the audience with further background informations. Here you can see excerpts from a film by Wolfgang Kiepenheuer, who made numerous films on the Nazi past in the 1950s for different institutions of the political education. In contrast to commercial cinema documentaries, controversial topics such as the Holocaust were addressed directly and put up for discussion. However, the films did not have any effect on the wider population beyond the discussion circles organized by the institutions of political education. As a third category of documentaries, I would like to mention the medium television, which had not yet been established as a mass medium in Germany in that time. In fact, the beginnings of early West German television surprised us with 3 productions dedicated to coming to terms with the recent past and especially with the thematization of the persecution and murder of the Jews. The first production to be mentioned here is the large-scale, very lavishly produced 14-part series Das Dritte Reich by the television channel WDR, which sets standards for coming to terms with the recent past in the early 1960s and can perhaps be considered a precursor of later history-tainment formats, albeit with different enlightening intentions that can be seen more clearly here. The second production is the broadcast series Eine Epoche vor Gericht, An Epoch in Court, produced and broadcasted by the NDR in 1961, which reported on the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in regular summaries and thus confronted the German audience directly and in detail with the Holocaust for the first time. The third production I would like to mention is the TV show Die Vergessenen, The Forgotten, which was broadcasted as early as 1956 and produced as a part of the long-running series Zeichen der Zeit, Signs of the Time, produced by the SDR. This program dealt with the fate of Jewish refugees who had successfully hidden from the Nazis in France and who now came out of hiding after the end of the war, completely impoverished, but for whom no one from the official side felt responsible. It consisted of an almost half-hour-long interlude film that vividly portrayed the difficult social situation of the Jews living in Paris. This was framed by a studio discussion with well-known intellectuals. The aim was not only sober reporting, but to generate public pressure on the responsible politicians. To this end, the various ARD broadcasting stations, mean all German television channels, joined forces and broadcast the TV show together, a process that is hard to imagine today. At the time, by the way, with success. The German parliament actually decided to set up an aid fund for the affected Jews. What lessons can be learned from this? What was particularly interesting for me were the unexpectedly heterogeneous approaches of the production of documentary films in the context of political education work and especially also of television as a newly establishing medium. Even if these films had not the same impact on a mass audience as, for example, at the end of the 70s, the series Holocaust, the story of the family Weiss, they show both innovative and critical approaches to dealing with the Nazi past in West Germany at the time, which historians have not yet taken into account. If you would like to learn more about documentary films of the early Federal Republic of Germany, you will find clearly arranged information in our recently published book Revisionen, published by Avenus. Please also note the database on the history of documentary film in Germany, DB dokumentarfilmgeschichte.de, as well as further publications of the research project which have been published on the new platform edition.dokumentarfilmgeschichte.de. Both websites are open access. Thank you for your attention.